NASA lost its way. It really did. Possibly it came about because we were all the same age when we started. I think Chris Kraft's a couple months younger than me. Some of the leaders, including Chris, became rather domineering, intimidated the crew. That shouldn't have been the way it was. I was never intimidated by Chris, and he knows that. He's a very dear friend. Only one cold tablet can say it relieved my stuffy nose in space. Only Actifed.
Only one cold tablet can say it relieved my sneezing in space. Only Actifed.
Only Actifed has been on every manned U.S. space flight since Apollo 7. It comes to you full strength without a prescription. Only Actifed is the cold tablet most recommended by doctors.
Only one cold tablet can say all that.
Only Actifed.
Scene one, take one. I am John Glenn, one of our astronauts who is preparing for our first manned ballistic flights into space. Naturally, all of us take a very deep personal interest, needless to say, in the Mercury capsule here, that one of us will ride one of these days into space. And we take every opportunity while we're here at Cape Canaveral to work as closely as we can with the technicians who are manning the capsule and preparing it for these first flights. These technicians here are from the National Aeronautic and Space Administration and also from the McDonnell Aircraft Company, the builders of the capsule. The white room that you see here demonstrates to a degree the lengths that we go to make the capsule or keep the capsule as clean as we possibly can in preparation for the space flights. Just as our clothing here, the sterile clothing, adds to the cleanliness that we try and maintain. This has been indicative, to a degree at least, of the high standards that have been required during the manufacture of the capsule and all of the production of it, all the way through the whole production process. Safety has always been put first above meeting any particular deadlines. We're ready to start one of these final tests prior to our going to the pad now, and I'm to take my place in a moment as the capsule observer inside the capsule.
In slate.
Seven and a half hours is a long time.
I agree with you on that.
Sitting, there is some hazarding for 7.5 hours, as you know. Did you follow any routine in particular? Did you do as we asked and flex your ankles, move your toes, strain at the calf?
I felt I had to do that. You do feel cramped, as you say.
You become restless.
This is, of course, quite different than our normal attitude. We'll be on our back, almost in a prone position. I notice, though, that it's easier to move your legs, as I am right now, in a seated condition, because you can just swing your legs. But on your back, you have to lift your legs to flex your muscles. Although your advice to flex them is a darn good tip.
Wally, during this simulated mission, divided into parts for responding to the question, consider first liftoff and the orbital parts of the mission. At that point, all you have to do is just maintain comfort control. Were you able to do that?
The coolant valve settings that we were playing with in orbit sure proved a lot to me, because the intercom system was telling me what my suit inlet temperature was and what the suit outlet was, and looks like I like about 68 to 70 degrees.
Good. Now, the harder part of it, of course, is the re-entry phase, where the inner skin walls of the capsule approach 290 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, with this surface that hot, so close to you, inches away, were you able to perceive this temperature?
Only by radiation. I could feel the heat from the panels coming up on my cheeks through the clear section of the visor plate. And this was a very low order of heat, I'd say, like a nice sunny day out on the beach.
It was entirely comfortable.
Oh, yes. I also noticed on my hands, with the black leather surface facing the heat of the capsule wall, that the heat would build up on the black. Yet when I had the silver side toward it, it was very, very comfortable, and it only proves that the reflective qualities of the silver surface is really worth having.
A group of us were ordered to Washington. I was at test pilot school, I had graduated. I was flying the F-4, the Phantom II. I was one of the early test pilots, the 13th guy to fly ship number 1. Ordered to Washington. And a group of us, about 60 or 70 in this room, and there are 2 engineers and a shrink, we called him, a psychologist on the stage saying, wouldn't it be nice to get in a capsule on top of a rocket? And I said, no, I didn't want to do that. And they said they're going to have monkeys and chimpanzees. I knew I didn't want to do that. I really was not interested in the program. And I went back to Patuxent after that, and they said they'll get in touch with you. I talked to some of my peers at the test pilot school and also at the test center. They said, if you want to go higher, farther, and faster, give them some time. Take the test, see what it's like. So we ended up being one of those who, I think there were 30-some of us who went out to Albuquerque and had our physical exams, rather lengthy procedure, and something we didn't like very much, I might add. But it was interesting. Years later, I realized what they were trying to do was get background data to compare what we were like before a flight to what we were like after a flight. And that's why they took all these intricate physical tests. They'd never mentioned that to us. It would have been much more pleasant knowing that, at least. Well, one of the severest ones was the barium treatment, where you have your whole lower intestine and your stomach literally filled with barium. Then you have to run down this hallway with a white smock on with the open back trying to protect your body. That was rather demeaning. One of my favorite tests, which didn't bother me, frankly, was a psychological test where they put us in a soundproof room. There's a desk that I had to sit at. I looked over and there's a cot off to the right. And what am I supposed to do? And he said, well, you won't see anything. We'll turn the lights out. Be all quiet. And, oh, okay. So they closed the door, and I grabbed the pillow, put it on the desk, and I fell asleep. I have no idea whether I was in there for 5 minutes or 5 hours. So apparently I passed that test because I was one of those that I thought I was worried about. What's interesting, on my Mercury flight, I fell asleep on the way to the launch pad. On Gordon Cooper's flight, he fell asleep on the launch pad. So it proved that maybe those who could sleep easily were candidates, I'm not sure. It still was something I felt I could get away from. I even today say I worked with NASA, never for NASA. And I always said, I'll stick around as long as I think it's all right. And I think most of us had that same kind of attitude. And the result of it was we had that comfort of saying, I'm not stuck here. I can change my orders if I want to. And I'll never forget sitting in this office, the 7 of us in one office, with what we call large steel desks. We abbreviated that to LSD, and the secretary outside. And so we started looking at each other, interesting, what's he, who's he? I had known Shepard briefly before. That's the first guy I knew. And I met him while we were skating at a motel while we were in the selection program. Rather amazing. But the rest of the guys I had not known. And how amazing that bond came to be. Unbelievable. Well, we bonded very fast. We knew we were competing with each other. We also knew we had to help each other. And that was probably the significant part. We had what I guess we'd call a sibling rivalry, who wanted the first flight and that kind of thing. But each week we would go off on different missions. I went to Akron, Ohio a lot to help develop what became the spacesuit, which of course is called the full pressure suit. Recently I was talking to Gordon Cooper, and he went to Huntsville, Alabama to look at all the boosters. Redstone, of course, we had 2 missions on it. And then the rest of us eventually went to San Diego, where I live now, to look at the Atlas being built there. So we came back from these trips, each one of us on a Friday. Most of the time we were flying commercially, landed in Washington National, and then drove back down to Langley. And on a Friday afternoon, we'd sit there and debrief each other on what we had seen that week completely. Nothing was ever kept from the other guy. You always felt that this was something we all had to learn. We started getting bonded closer and closer and closer. And the interesting part is we were all military test pilots. And I was taught a test pilot is a communicator that goes between pilots and engineers. So we had to wear both hats. And here we were designing our own vehicles. So we were not only test pilots, we were test engineers. It was rather interesting how closely we got involved together. But in addition, how closely we became involved with the engineers. And we would go to the plant and get to know the president of the company, McDonald, Mr. Mack, as we call him, John Yardley, Walter Burke, Ralph Generally. All these guys were old buddies. That's going from a mechanic all the way up to the president of the company. We had that kind of access. And that's probably what brought it all together, because people never held back. And I learned something from von Braun quite early, by the way. He said, if you have an office, you should have two things: an open front door, always open, and a back door from which you can escape the room. And I like that logic. And we had an open door throughout the space program, throughout the space community. Any company, Coast Guard, Navy, Air Force, just amazing how people would receive us with open arms, really. The biggest shock I ever had in my life, the 7 of us came parading in CCGGSSS, Carpenter, Cooper, Glenn, Grissom, Schirra, Shepard, Slayton, announced to the world that we were looking around, all these people, reporters. The one thing in the movie, The Right Stuff, that was pretty close to reality were these crazy reporters buzzing around with cameras, looked like a bunch of bees descending on us. And then they announced this, and I think one of my favorite pictures, I still have it at home, someone asked, which of you would like to have a space flight? And I had 2 hands up. John Glenn had 2 hands up. At the very end, where Carpenter came in first, there were 3 hands up. So the guy in back of him, who was a doctor, who put his hand up. Looks like Scott has 3 hands up in the air. Not many people noticed that in the picture. But from that point on, we began to realize something had happened. We went over to the Hill, and we were escorted into Lyndon Johnson's Senate Majority Leader office. And with each one of us individually, they brought in a senator and a representative of our home area. They came in, they salaam, like people coming to the King of Siam. And what's this all about? I realized what a powerful man Lyndon Johnson was. We left and went out in the Capitol steps, and these crazy representatives and senators were racing around trying to get pictures taken with us. We said, you're the big guys, what do you want pictures of us for? It's amazing, that transition that one day. We had a big surprise one day. Bob Gilruth was the director of the Manned Spacecraft Center, the Space Task Group. It was the Space Task Group in Langley, of course, at that point. Manned Spacecraft Center came somewhat timer in Houston. And Gilruth said, gentlemen, we need to have a peer rating. I go, what's a peer rating? So it means you have to vote for someone else besides yourself. And years later I said, Shepard, I made a mistake voting for you. I never asked Al who he voted for. But it turned out the result of all that was that Shepard, Grissom, and Glenn were selected as the 3 who would be involved with the Mercury Redstone flights. The other 4 of us were pretty much shattered, dismayed is probably the way to put it. And Shepard looked around and said, I am that good, but we always teased. But Al, of course, had that first flight, and John was his backup. Then Gus had the second flight, and John was his backup. So John was kind of wondering what was happening. And somehow or other, John convinced everybody you don't need another Redstone flight, which it was scheduled to have. And John convinced them we should have an orbital flight. And Scott became his backup, Scott Carpenter. And Deke Slayton had the next flight scheduled, and Deke had this heart fibrillation. I was Deke's backup. I was totally shattered when it turned out they gave that second orbital flight to Scott Carpenter. I was very much annoyed, frankly. It turned out Scott had a lot of time working with John, so it was the right one. I lucked out. I had a beautiful mission, the third orbital flight. So I have no complaints. And of course, Gordo was my backup. Al Shepard was Gordo's backup, so we all worked together. Deke, of course, had been grounded all that time. I probably would say that Al would have had another Mercury flight or a Gemini flight, the first Gemini flight. It was really surprising. The first experience we had was to go to the Cape and see a Polaris, a submarine vehicle, below surface to air, blow up. I said, wow, we're going to do something like that? No way. Then we had a Redstone that lifted off all of 6 inches and settled back on the launch pad. And with me watching that was Max Vauget, who designed the Mercury spacecraft, Gemini and Apollo, really, the reentry technique, and the escape tower. We watched this thing go shoo, the escape tower, and Max said, I didn't think it'd go up that fast. And I said, I think that was the tower, Max. The spacecraft was going through its own logic. Next thing you know, a drogue parachute came out, and then the main parachute came out. All this is hanging over the side of the spacecraft, sitting on the launch pad. Then the sea diary marker came out. I'll never forget this part of that story, which I love. Von Braun and Kurt Debus were in the blockhouse with Bob Gilruth. And Werner said, Kurt, how are we going to defuel that? I go home and get my rifle. We'll put some holes in it. Bob Gilruth almost had a heart attack. So we started gotchas even that early. Fun people. We were very dismayed when Yuri Gagarin had that flight in April of '61. I still remember it quite vividly. And we could have flown Explorer long before Sputnik. We could have flown Shepard long before Yuri Gagarin. But we weren't aware of the fact that there was that kind of race as far as our potential went. I think that went all the way up through the lunar program. We were always wondering why are we working so fast? This, of course, to catch up in the Cold War. It was a battle, no doubt about it. But we were very much disappointed that we were not at least up to snuff, and we were not. We were way behind.
NASA lost its way. It really did. Possibly it came about because we were all the same age when we started. I think Chris Kraft's a couple months younger than I. Some of the leaders, including Chris, became rather domineering, intimidated the crew. That shouldn't have been the way it was. I was never intimidated by Chris, and he knows that. He's a very dear friend and a highly respected professional by me, at least, and by many others. NASA didn't learn how to sell itself. I mentioned that already. We had what we call an open door policy. There was always a door open anywhere, and I never was denied entrance to a meeting. And this was a meeting such as that where I determined that I had a mission rule not to launch if the wind was bad. The door was shut. There was a black room. There was a slide projection going on about the Block 1 couch being used in the Block 2 spacecraft, and I stood there. It was portrayed rather well in From Earth to the Moon, an HBO series. I said, I guess we have a new mission rule, don't we? We don't launch when the wind's like that. That came about only because there was nothing hidden from each other. Now, as time goes on, we talk about being a Bubba with George Abbey and being a friend of him, and that's not the way it was. We didn't have that.
Nunca se ve bailando en la pista sola.